In the United States, across all the government agencies that make this federalist system go, the National Park Service is the one Americans like the most. This much makes sense. They're not collecting taxes, they're not investigating or surveilling, they're wearing friendly uniforms and welcoming people into America's favorite landscapes and historical sites. But in the nation's capital city, in Washington, D.C., they're viewed differently. In the US, D.C. is a jurisdictional and administrative anomaly. It's not a territory, it's not a state, and it's not within a state. It's a city that comprises a district, a singular status not directly mimicked anywhere else in the US or even really the world. As such, the rules are different here. Without a state's presence in park management, it is the task of the National Park Service to operate DC's green spaces. That's 90% of the city's total park acreage spread across 350 separate sites, all of which varying in size and significance from tiny pockets of greenery to nothing short of the National Mall. Problem is, while well prepared to look after the Yellowstones and Yosemites of the nation, the National Park Service is out of its depth when it comes to operating your run-of-the-mill city park. Take Lincoln Park, the largest on Capitol Hill and one of the busiest. Since 1791, when Pierre L'Enfant drew up designs for the city, this park was meant for public use, and it's used by the public today for walks, for picnics, for frisbee, for a place to take the dog out. But for years, there's been tension over that last use: dogs. Dogs are allowed in the park, but on a leash. But it's a big park and there's really no alternative spaces, so some dog owners nix the leash to let them run, and this creates tension. Dog owners want somewhere for their dogs to get some exercise, but park users don't want to deal with dogs off leash. A potential compromise does exist. Take some of the park, put up a fence, and make it a dog park. This much is a popular idea, but there's an issue. The National Park Service, mandated to preserve and protect land for the betterment of future generations, simply doesn't do dog parks. They really don't do anything to promote active use of any parks, really. No new sports fields, no playgrounds, no unpaved bike trails, all uses they deem antithetical to the mandate. So dog owners can head 4 blocks up Tennessee Avenue and unleash their dogs in the rather small gravel lot designated by the city as a dog park, or they can defy the rules and hope they don't get a ticket. But dogs are far from the only sticking point. Here, at the eastern end of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, local residents want to invest in making the park area an attraction. They want to invest in ADA-accessible trails, lighting, and signage that tells the canal's story. They want to celebrate the canal in a way that will bring more people and more dollars in. The NPS, for their part, isn't really concerned with increasing passerbys, though. It's their job, as they see it, to protect the canal for future generations, so they're investing in the canal, but to ensure its physical stability, keeping it structurally sound for decades to come. Ultimately, DC residents can and do complain, vent with one another on Reddit, write about missed opportunities and overall failings of their federal park managers and local publications. But by how the district is currently governed, they can't really do much else. And federal presence is annoying in a whole host of other manners. For the DC resident, there's the occasional motorcade that halts traffic for 10 to 20 minutes at a time. There's the unrelenting buzz of tens of thousands of annual helicopter flights within the 30-mile radius of Reagan National Airport, nearly 40% of which military-related, and one of which involved in the most deadly American commercial aviation crash in more than 2 decades. There's also this, a small power plant in the heart of the city that serves federal buildings and has been leveraged as a political pawn for decades. As late as the early 2000s, this plant ran on coal at the behest of senators with sway from coal country states, keeping the lights on at the Capitol, but pushing entirely unnecessary particulates into the DC air. And the list goes on. There's the Height of Buildings Act that was passed by Congress in 1910, which keeps most areas of the city capped at buildings no higher than 90 or 130 feet or 9 to 13 stories high, contributing to housing difficulties and rising prices today. For the 700,000 that live in the city of DC, these are the simple realities of life in a district where some 30% of the city footprint is held by the federal government. And beyond proximity to the heart of America's federal government, there comes additional complications in the fact that the district does not enjoy statehood status. The most obvious limitation that comes with lack of statehood is a lack of representation in the federal government. In the US, each and every state gets 2 representatives in the Senate and a number of seats in the House of Representatives apportioned in relation to the state's population. The District of Columbia, whose population pays federal taxes, gets no senators nor House members. While the district's congressional representative, delegate to the House Eleanor Holmes Norton, for example, introduced legislation to address the issue of the NPS mandate getting in the way of DC actually enjoying its parks in early 2025, there was really nothing more she could do. She's a delegate only. not a voting member. But beyond representation in Congress, the difficulties of districthood extend further. For a graduating senior from a DC high school, there's only one option to go to school on in-district tuition, and that's at the University of DC, which is primarily a commuter school with a modest student body of under 4,000. Should this student want to go elsewhere, they can apply for a DC grant that will put $10,000 towards their out-of-state tuition, but compared to a kid who has access to in-state tuition, that's a drop in the bucket. Should a Coloradan, for example, want to stay in-state and attend CU Boulder, tuition will be in the mid-30,000s. A number that's steeply discounted when compared to the out-of-state tuition sitting in the mid-60,000s. Then there's the judicial system. Without a state constitution and without a governor, the matter of naming judges to DC courts is the privilege of the US President and US Congress. In the DC Court of Appeals, 9 judges are nominated by a selection committee, then approved by the President and the Senate. In the Superior Court of the District of Columbia, the President and Senate again have to approve the judges. In a vacuum of state authority, this seems fairly pragmatic because who else would do it? But then there's the fact that Congress has a say in approval. A legislative body that is populated by members that do not represent DC in any way, that DC residents had no say in voting on and naming. That much feels far from democratic. All this leaves DC in a singularly awkward spot. It's democratic, mostly, as residents do vote on local matters and in presidential elections. And with a city government bracketed by a federal one, it does operate within a federal system, sort of. For the average American who made it through grade school, the story of DC is a familiar one. Following independence, the capital bounced around between Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. But southern states wanted a more neutral territory for the head of government, so the fledgling nation agreed on the Residence Act to set it here, a site, quote, not exceeding 10 square miles on the banks of the Potomac River between the mouths of the Eastern Branch and Conococheague. This would be the home of Congress and the President, serving as an unbiased administrative center of federal power, and the design would reflect as much. Everything in the new city would center around the United States Capitol building, with grand avenues running parallel to the Potomac and a grid system of north-south and east-west streets filling out the entire city. One of the grand avenues, Pennsylvania Avenue, connected Congress's house with the President's house. As the physical embodiment of a federalist system of government, a third of the entire district came to be owned by the federal government itself. But that leaves a lot of land not owned by the government and not represented by a state. Per the DC Organic Act of 1801, Congress would have full authority over the district and its local affairs, and ever since, the issue of representation and representative democracy has been a topic of local frustration. But in the intervening 2 centuries, there have been compromises. In the 1960s, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, DC, one of America's blackest cities, first secured the right for residents to vote in presidential elections, then secured the right to establish a school board, and then the right to send a non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives. Then, the biggest step towards self-governance came in 1973 with the Home Rule Act. Home Rule gave DC its own popularly elected mayor and a 13-member city council, which were given the power to set their own local laws and ordinances for its 131 neighborhoods spread across 8 wards. But Home Rule did not give DC autonomy. DC, for example, can set its own budget. It can raise money through taxes on non-federal property and non-federal workers within the city to fund this budget, but it can't, by itself, approve its own budget. It still requires congressional approval, even though the budget is likely to have little to do with any federal lands, federal issues, and is likely to require little federal funding beyond a sum usually designated to offset the revenue lost on account of such a heavy federal and thus untaxable presence. This is patronizing, and such oversight is not limited to just spending. DC, through Home Rule, establishes its own laws and ordinances just like any other city. But again, unlike any other city, these laws can be blocked by Congress. In fact, they have 2 ways to block DC laws they don't like. Should the city pass something that will require funding, Congress can simply insert language in a spending bill that bans money from going towards the new law or program they take issue with. Or, should a House member catch something in their review of a pending DC law they don't like, they can begin a disapproval procedure that, should it gain popular support, will see the measure to disapprove a DC law be voted on by Congress and then signed by the President. Of these 2 options, the former is more common, as Congress opted to cut local funding for abortions through Medicaid in 1988, or in 1996 when it opted to not fund a clean needle exchange program in the city. But historically, since the advent of Home Rule, neither means of shooting down local laws is terribly common. Congress only shoots down local laws a few times every decade. And largely the same goes with the budget. Most years, DC gets the green light from Congress with little fuss, and this has largely kept the peace. Residents are generally willing to live with the lack of true democratic representation so long as Congress stays out of their affairs, while Congress doesn't really rock the boat too terribly often so as not to rekindle any sort of DC statehood movements that have popped up now and again throughout the Home Rule era. Across 50 years then, DC residents and the federal government have settled for a vague, largely unspoken, status quo sort of relationship. Generally, Congress leaves the city alone. Generally, city residents don't really care. On occasion, when the city's policies veer too far and often too liberal for Congress's comfort, it reins the city in, which in turn leads to an upswell of talk about statehood and taxation without representation. But these moments are few and far between. Or at least, they used to be. The most concrete example of the evolving relationship between the city of DC and the federal government are these two blocks of pavement just north of the White House. In 2020, in the final year of Trump's first term and at the height of frustration and defiance towards the administration, this mural was painted across the two blocks. It was commissioned by the city, and the area was renamed Black Lives Matter Plaza by City Mayor Muriel Bowser. For the next 4 years, the plaza kept the name, surviving legal challenges and conservative backlash. Then came the second Trump campaign. Following the fatal shooting of federal employee Mike Gill in January of 2024, Trump began floating the idea of major structural changes to DC governance on account of what he framed as the city's rampant violence. While this first came only as a follow-up on campaign trail promises and social media fodder, real threats to DC from an increasingly emboldened and increasingly Republican Congress came not long after, punctuated by Georgia's Andrew Clyde proposing legislation that would halt city funding unless Black Lives Matter Plaza was torn down. Sensing an increasingly conservative Congress wasn't bluffing, Mayor Bowser gave in, stating that the potential loss of money and then jobs would prove far more damaging to the city. In March, construction crews tore the mural away. But the end of BLM Plaza didn't mark the end of increased federal involvement in local DC affairs. It signaled just the beginning. From the executive branch, President Trump in March signed the Making the District of Columbia Safe and Beautiful executive order, which, among other things, pushed the National Park Service to begin removing homeless camps within the district's federal lands. That same month, Congress got involved with DC's budget. In the haste to pass the spending bill that would avert government shutdown at the last minute, Congress failed to update the provision that allowed DC to spend its own tax revenues to reflect 2025 numbers rather than 2024's. Effectively, the glitch, as it's been called, has been presented as a mistake. But it's a mistake with consequences, as using the 2024 numbers for 2025 has put the city out of about $1 billion of its own money. Trump said it was a mistake that should be fixed soon, and in May, Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, said it was a mistake they'd soon remedy. But while just about all of Congress seems to agree, as of August 2025, no bill to release the money for an increasingly desperate DC has reached the floor for a vote. This has forced the city to enter a hiring freeze, to use supplemental money to hold off cuts to police and education, and to basically beg for the bill to get some attention because that's really all they have the power to do. In a nation so proud of its democracy, its very own capital city can't access the dollars it raised through local taxes because it's being held up in a federal body where city residents have no representation. In the meantime, Congress members have said they're getting around to it, but they've just been too busy. And yet, in that same time period, they've gone ahead and successfully voted to rescind DC laws that made it possible for non-citizens to vote in DC elections and curtailed the police union's ability to challenge disciplinary decisions. The budget uncertainties extend beyond 2025, too. In January, this bit of land here became the property of DC for the next 99 years. An exciting development for a city working on bringing the area's football team, the Washington Commanders, out of Maryland and back to the district. This will require a new stadium, which will require funds from the city, which will require congressional approval. But as the mayor works hard to sell city council on the project, federal politics have created a wave of uncertainty. Because the Commanders now go by the name the Commanders, rather than their insensitive historical moniker, the Redskins, President Trump has mentioned on social media he may look to intervene on the stadium deal to ensure the name's reversed. On the surface, this seems like the type of empty threat that the president is known for, but if the approach to the stadium matches the approach to crime and violence in the city, maybe it does carry some weight. On August 11th, the lines between performative rhetoric and real federal intervention in DC became blurred with this executive order. It outlined that DC violent crime had reached a crisis point and thus should be declared nothing short of a formal emergency, creating special conditions that allow for further federal intervention. While the order was largely vague in its mandate, the US Federal Attorney General Pam Bondi immediately jumped to its most radical interpretation as she pushed to install head of the DEA Terry Cole to serve as temporary head of the Metropolitan Police. This didn't last, as DC's Attorney General filed a lawsuit in federal court, which resulted in the Justice Department standing down. While the Home Rule Act may give the president and the federal government power to use the Metropolitan Police, it's a far-fetched interpretation of the law to say that federal powers are able to take control of the force in the face of an emergency. Rather, to a certain image of control, the Trump administration has called on the National Guard, with some 1,100 members arriving in the city to undertake nebulous orders to roam its streets. And while not conducting law enforcement activities, statements from the White House have suggested that they may well be armed and they may hold and detain someone until proper local authorities are able to arrive unseen. Where exactly this supposed crackdown on crime ends up remains to be seen. The city's crime rates have already hit 30-year lows prior to the crackdown, even though homicide rates have risen since their century low a decade ago. But what matters is that all this increased federal meddling and scrutiny from the president and Congress, barring the overreach of trying to name a new head of police, is more or less legal by the letter of the law. For half a century, Home Rule has offered an uneasy compromise between two extremes: DC statehood and complete federal control. But it has also blurred the reality that while the district can elect its own local government and functionally operate sort of like a state, at the end of the day, power over the district rests with the federal government. Congress controls the budget, Congress has the ability to intervene in local lawmaking. But this much doesn't often matter because it doesn't often get challenged. This has all changed in the matter of a single year, though, and the conservative push to further flex federal muscles in the district is having a polarizing impact. Conservatives are increasingly in favor of stronger federal control over DC, while liberal-leaning Americans and city residents themselves are increasingly emboldened to speak on the idea of DC statehood. Home Rule is but one of many separate eras of management in DC, and increasingly, it's beginning to feel like one that no longer serves the present or the future. I've got what I think is a great suggestion for what you should watch next. It's a Nebula original documentary of sorts called 17 Pages, made by Bobby Broccoli. On the surface, it's about one of the largest scientific controversies of the 20th century, but down below, it's kind of not, for reasons I can't really say without ruining the, frankly, incredible twist. You just have to trust me that it's the kind of thing a Wendover viewer would enjoy, but you can also trust all of these comments saying how good it was. What makes Nebula so good, in my opinion, is that it's a streaming service that supports audacious ideas from independent creators, the kinds that would never make their way through a Netflix or Disney development committee. For example, Maggie Mae Fish said she wanted to make a kids show, but for adults, so now that exists. It's called Amy's Dead End Dreamhouse, and in my opinion, it's excellent. One of the characters is a cinder block named Cindy. We at Wendover said we wanted to make a reality competition show where the contestants thought they were trying to root out the moles sabotaging their success, but in reality we told each and every one of them that they were the mole, so they were all so preoccupied trying not to get caught that they didn't realize everyone else was doing the same. The point is, there's a lot of great Nebula originals on Nebula. And that's not even the entire selling point of the platform. A curated group of a couple hundred top-quality creators are all posting their regular videos there ad and sponsorship-free, meaning you get even less interruption than with YouTube Premium, and it even costs less. When you use our code nebula.tv/Wendover, you'll get 40% off an annual plan, which brings the effective per-month cost down to just $3. When you do that, you're even helping support our work here at Wendover, so a big thanks to you if you do sign up.